This episode of Crosscut Talks is supported by Alaska Airlines.
Hey, welcome to Crosscut Talks. I'm Mark Baumgarten, the managing editor at Crosscut. And today we're talking about Black American history, which is to say that we're talking about American history, because it's impossible to tell this country's story without talking about the experience of Black Americans, those who were enslaved here and those who have lived in the shadow of that horrific history, creating a unique American culture while fighting for the recognition of their civil and human rights. This isn't to say that Black people have been entirely absent from the accepted version of American history. The Underground Railroad, Jim Crow laws, the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. These are all things I learned in high school. But there is much, much more to the story than that. And we're in a moment where that history is finally being told. And a part of telling that history is to change the way that we view history. And this is why I find today's conversation so interesting. Ibram X. Kendi and Keisha N. Blain are two of the leading lights in this effort. Together, they've curated a collective history of the African American experience called 400 Souls. The two editors of this collection sat down with journalist Soledad O'Brien to discuss their work, and their answers are enlightening, but so are her questions. She's not just interested in the what here. She wants to know how this history was compiled. And the answers are revealing and, of course, complicating, because history is complicated. This conversation and all other conversations on the keynote track at the 2021 Crosscut Festival is sponsored by BECU, which would like to share the following message. BECU believes every forward thinker deserves added momentum, so for over 85 years they have offered financial services and support to the community. Members have access to local financial centers, over 30,000 ATMs through the co-op network, and online resources. BECU is a member-owned credit union that puts people over profit. Learn more at becu.org, federally insured by NCUA. I hope you enjoy the talk. If you have any feedback, please send it to talks@crosscut.com. Okay, on with the show.
It is so nice to talk to both of you. Let's jump right in. 90 writers. That sounds utterly unmanageable and sort of overwhelming. Why don't you start for me, Ibram, with a look at how you chose them, and then maybe you can jump in as well, Keisha, with the criteria, what you were hoping to create by these disparate voices.
I think we first divided 400 years into 5-year increments. And then when we started looking at these 5-year periods, we started thinking about, what are the defining or critical things, events, people, places that happened during this 5-year period. And so there were certain, things that jumped out at us. Obviously the first chapter, which was written by Nicole Hannah-Jones, the arrival, this inaugural ship in 1619, or the last chapter, which was written by Alicia Garza, of course, Black Lives Matter. And so what we did is we tried to figure out, okay, who are the writers who have been writing on these topics? Who are the writers who have been already guiding the nation to understand this period or this person or this place in American history? And we reached out to them.
And they said yes. Keisha, I'm curious how you thought about balancing the voices, because there are so many talented writers, and I'm sure there were so many people who'd be thrilled to be part of a project like this because it's so unusual and so rare. What were your strategies going in and how to manage so much material?
Yes, well, one of the things that we really wanted to do was to capture the spirit of community. And of course, it's in our title, it's a community history of African America. And that meant trying to pull as many diverse voices and perspectives as possible I think if we had pulled together 90 professional historians, we probably would have ended up with essays that were similar. Certainly people would have employed similar methods, might have engaged topics in similar ways. And the beauty of bringing together people from diverse backgrounds meant that readers have a truly remarkable experience, because they're able to grapple with their history, not solely through the lens of professional historians, but through journalists, through creative writers and economists and political scientists and philosophers. So part of it was trying to make it a fun experience, I think, for the readers. And so we actually kept track. We kept track of, how many historians we had invited. We kept track of how many creative writers, journalists, because we wanted to have that balance.
Big giant spreadsheet of who's contributing to a remarkable compilation of a history that hadn't been gathered. Early in the book, in reference to the Mayflower story of America's first arrivals, there's a quote from W.B. Du Bois, and he says, "It is propaganda like this that has led men in the past to insist that history is, quote, lies agreed upon." Tell me some of those lies. Maybe, Ibram, you can start us off. What are the lies that people have agreed upon that I think not just the historians or the people who talk about history, but are also, I think, taught us in school as children?
Wow, where do we even begin? I think one lie that we certainly wanted to debunk through 400 Souls is this idea that Black people are a monolith. And so, there's so much diversity within Black America, among Black people, and we wanted to sort of demonstrate that through these 90 writers. Another lie is that there's something wrong or inferior about Black people. And every single writer in many ways grappled with that and pushed back against that and actually, told the truth about the sheer humanity of Black people.
There is. Oh, go ahead. Excuse me, Keisha. Forgive me.
Sure,
go ahead.
sure. I was going to just throw in a couple of other lies. I'll just focus on one in particular, and that is the lie concerning slavery. There's a general understanding, I think, today, certainly, that slavery as an institution was terrible. But it's interesting, if you go back to history textbooks, the way that people have written about slavery has not actually captured how terrible it was as an institution. And there are always these narratives that try to suggest that, well, it was probably not so bad. And there were some friendly slaveholders. Some people were really nice to enslaved people. And that is certainly something that I think 400 Souls really shatters, because it helps us to see that this is not an institution we could talk about lightly. We can't, forget the fact that people were treated as property.
Ibram, there was a decision made to have, I guess you'd call them lyrical interludes in between these periods of history. Why did you set it up that way? What does that add?
Well, first, when we're thinking about the writing community, especially the writing community today in Black America, like America more broadly, you can't really think about the writing community without poets. And indeed, one of the things that Professor Blain has said consistently is when you're reading the sections, it's almost like, you're on a train, headed down a sort of a path of, and eventually you need a break and you need to reflect, and you need to reflect on the entirety of the section that you had just read. And indeed, those lyrical interludes, those poets, all of whom typically they read the actual essays in their section, and every sort of section ends with a poet. It allows the reader to actually reflect on that section, on that period of history, and it allows that reader to also understand that history from a different type of perspective. And I think those poets and those poems were just an absolute critical tapestry within the book.
Professor Blain, Molefi Keti Asante says this, that out of the cauldron that was developing under the hegemony of Europeans, several types emerged, including those that would record events, interpret events, et cetera, et cetera. Walk me through these types and tell me their significance in preserving the history of slavery and the arrival of Africans in North America, because they're essential to the storytelling.
Absolutely. I think, today we often talk about, well, we talk about the role of historians, certainly. And oftentimes when we focus on historians in the professional sense, we talk about individuals who have studied, they have become professionalized. Many of us have obtained PhDs in history, for example, and we certainly do play a significant role, I think, in uncovering the stories of the past in order to illuminate the present. But one of the other, I think, significant contributions is the role of, what we term as the griot, right? As the person who might not have necessarily had some sort of professional training. But part of what they are able to do is to tell the history through the process of oral histories, of being able to pass on stories. And I think that part of the history that certainly Professor Molefi Asante emphasizes, among others, is crucial to helping us think about how history is preserved and remembered. And we tried, I think, in 400 Souls to pull on all of these strands and all of these contributions beyond just the formal training, but also think carefully about oral histories for one, as one quick example.
Yeah, an important example. There's an author who talks about whiteness as a ledge you can only fall from. What was meant? She's in this talking about a white man who's been beaten for having sex with a black woman, not because he had defiled her or abused her, but because he had tainted his whiteness. What explain what the ledge means, and talk about that ledge, if you will, Ibram. Where did that come from? What moment in time was protecting racial purity, not falling off that ledge at any cost, a focus and essential?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's Ijioma's just incredible piece. And indeed, I mean, I think one way we can understand it is there's just this long-standing notion of whiteness as pure. And indeed, whiteness, like anything that's apparently pure, can be made unpure. And the way it be made unpure in a sort of biological sense is through that one drop. So this is the sort of idea of, if you have a drop of the blood of people who are not of European descent, then you suddenly are not sort of white anymore. And I think this is, Ijeoma, who is writing on a very critical sort of case that happened in the 1630s, and she's really comparing her personal experience as a biracial woman who is read and projected and treated as Black, and has been her whole life, despite her mother being white. And indeed, as somebody who's certainly is certainly not purely white, and I think it was just an incredible piece, and I've heard such incredible feedback from that piece in particular. And I'm speaking. I want to speak more about it, but I don't want to give it away, because I think it's one of those early jewels in the book.
Yeah, it's an amazing piece. And for me, as someone who's mixed race, I read it as well. And just, this idea that she didn't want to let whiteness claim her, I think was the phrase that she used, was fascinating. Is that a modern phenomenon? Is that, has that shifted how people think about that over time? Is that something that we just think about today? What do you think, Professor Blain?
I don't think that much has changed. It's actually somewhat ironic that Ijeoma is writing about the 1600s, but much of what she outlines can be understood in the modern context. I think there's still I think we still refer to it as a one drop rule, right? There's this perception still that if a person, is mixed race, it ultimately, if they have a Black parent, they are categorized as Black, right? And they are classified as such, and they are treated as such. And so I think that, even though we generally think that we have progressed in our, in our understanding of race over so many years, the irony is that a lot of these ideas remain salient.
Interesting. Talk to me a little bit, if you will, about Black women's labor. And Professor Blain, I'll start with you, and then Professor Kendi, I'll have you jump in on that as well. How was the status of Black women defined and valued in the mid 1600s? And how did you see that shift and change and grow, or maybe more relevantly, not change and grow as time passed on? Will you start for me, Professor Blain?
Yes, we wanted to really highlight the significance of Black women's labor, and particularly starting, of course, with the era of slavery. And we asked historian Jennifer Morgan to write an essay that helps us see how much this history is a gendered history, and meaning that, one of the things she talks about in her essay is the fact that enslaved Black women ultimately so any children that they gave birth to by default, became born into an institution of slavery. And so it was about being able to trace one's classification as an enslaved person, right, through the lineage of the mother. And so that is how crucial, we can think about slavery, particularly through the experiences of Black women. And then, of course, something that she talks about, but also Brenda Stevenson talks about, Black women's labor and about the fact that when slaveholders, and traders were making decisions about, enslaved people, there was a high value placed on Black women, because the idea was that they would be able to work. They would be able to work, for themselves, but also be able to reproduce. And so the notion is that even in trading, that women would be of high value for their future prospects, and to further expand laborers on the plantation. And so the theme of Black women's labor is central to understanding the development of slavery in the United States. And those two examples, those two essays in particular, I think help us see how all of this comes together.
It lingers for generations, doesn't it, Professor Kendi?
It does, and indeed, I mean, I think if we could sort of boil it down, at a basic level, it was conceived of this idea that to be a man is to be a worker, to be a woman at that time, just as many think today is to be a mother and a wife. But to be a Black woman then was also to be a worker. And so what happened is there was this sort of mix of sexist and racist ideas that it, in a way, made Black women not only whether you want to conceive of them as, quote, men or not women. And they were treated sort of and demeaned, as such, specifically as it related to white women. And you see that still today. You still see, for instance, one of the oldest tropes as Black feminist historians have written about is this idea of the sort of masculine, strong Black woman who's pretty much like a man. And it sort of goes all the way back to this period that Jennifer Morgan and Brenda Stephen were writing about.
One of the poems is by Jericho Brown, and he says this: "We'd like a list of what we lost." And one has to imagine that would be a pretty long list. So, Professor Blain, what's on that list?
Money. Wealth. One of the things that I often reflect on, which is mind-boggling to me, is the fact that before the Civil War, the estimated value of enslaved people in the United States was somewhere between and $3.5 billion. And you think about that, and then of course, fast forward to the present when you grapple with the realities of the racial wealth gap, and you think about what it means for the same group of people who built the United States, actually built the United States from the ground up, and sacrificed so much for decades, ends up being the same group of individuals at the bottom of the economic ladder. And so, what have we lost? Lots of money and wealth for not only ourselves, but for our children and our children's children. And we know how much wealth matters in this country.
What would you put on that list after wealth, which I do think is right at the top?
I mean, life itself. And I mean, even when we think of white privilege, there may be no greater white privilege than life itself. Whether you're talking about the gap right now in life expectancy, whether you're talking about the number of Black people who are killed by the police, or even during the sort of era of enslavement, which spanned the majority of 400 years, which spanned the majority of 400 souls. You know, the number of Black people who lost their lives resisting, pushing for the most basic human desire, which was freedom. Or the number of people who lost their lives because they were Black. I mean, I just don't, I mean, you know, between livelihood and life itself, I mean, I don't know of any two greater things we've lost.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go toward the end and talk about Alicia Garza's, what she wrote. She presents protests over the killings of Black people and America's structural inequalities as a Black renaissance in a way. Can you explain that to me? And Professor Blain, why don't you start for me?
Absolutely. You know, I would, of course, emphasize the significance of having Alicia Garza write this piece to talk about Black Lives Matter. I think there is no other movement, quite frankly, certainly in our recent history, that has truly transformed the American political landscape. And I would even say it has transformed global politics too. We saw that particularly over the last 12 months or so with the uprisings in the spring and in the summer. And to think about this as a Renaissance moment, I think is important to signify just the vibrancy, just the way that people have come together, certainly people of African descent, but actually I think as we saw in the last couple months, what is so powerful too about Black Lives Matter as a movement, it's how it has brought people together from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, who are committed to social justice. And so this is truly a moment of change. I know, of course, as historians, we know that change can often be a slow process, and we know that things won't happen overnight. But I do think this is a moment that we are beginning to turn the corner, so to speak. And of course, Black Lives Matter has played such a fundamental role in getting us to at least talk about anti-Black racism, to talk about police violence, and hopefully to continue making steps forward for change.
This is a little bit like asking people if they have a favorite child. So I recognize that going into this question. But do you have an essay that is your personal favorite? Is that a secret you'll take to your graves when you've asked 90 writers to contribute? What was the one that struck you in a certain way? Why don't you start for me, Professor Blain, and then we'll go to Professor Kendi.
Well, I love all of the essays and poems, but I have to say that the one that probably moved me the most, and I think moved me to tears the first time that I read it, was Keisha, a layman's essay on cotton. And there's just something so beautiful about that essay and the way that it connects, certainly to the history. But Keisha was able to connect to his own personal story and to talk about growing up in Mississippi and being in his grandmother's house and the feeling of cotton and what it meant for him, as a child, and to connect that to the significant role of cotton in Black life and culture, particularly in the South. And that was just an essay that, since I read it the first time, stayed with me. And I just, I think all the essays are remarkable. I'll reiterate that, but that particular essay is so moving to me.
How about you, Professor Kendi?
So I have so many favorites, and I feel like I try to express a different one, each time. I think the piece that I'm thinking about now is, I think, a piece we already talked a little bit about, and that's Nicole Hannah-Jones' opening piece. And I think the reason why that piece really for me was so powerful is, I mean, the contrasting, of the White Lion. The White Lion is the name of the ship that carried the 20 or odd enslaved Africans that arrived in August of 1619, and contrasting that ship with the Mayflower that arrived in 1620, and how she was able to articulate, very clearly that we're constantly taught about the Mayflower. And indeed, it's a significant sort of important ship that should be talked about. But why aren't we also taught about the White Lion? And because if indeed, as she writes, the Mayflower is the heralding of American freedom, then the White Lion is the heralding of American slavery.
We'll be back with more after this message.
Ready to take your travels to the next level? Alaska Airlines is committed to providing a higher standard of safety and cleanliness throughout your journey. From mask requirements and touch-free options to HEPA filters on board and everything in between. Plus, their award-winning loyalty program, Mileage Plan, makes it easy to earn and redeem miles wherever you go, including destinations worldwide, thanks to their One World Alliance membership. If you're ready to land a low fare, next-level care, and the best experience in the air, book now at alaskaair.com.
Hi, everybody who's here for the live interview today. We're going to welcome Ibram and Keisha back for a few minutes of audience questions. Thank you guys for this conversation. Here's the first question. One of the most insidious types of bills in states today are those that try to restrict educators from teaching a more comprehensive U.S. history. How can we effectively fight these efforts? I really like this question because I hear it a lot. People listen to what you both talk about and I think are very interested in the history and the point of view of the readings. And then they're sort of, what do we do if they're not a historian, if they don't necessarily have a giant platform, if they're not a governor of a state? What kind of advice do you give people?
Start. Oh.
No, please.
I'll just say briefly that there are several ways, I think, to tackle this. I think certainly if one is a parent and, with school-age children, there are ways that you can certainly challenge, whether it is your local school district. There are ways that you can make demands and make your voice heard as it pertains to the curriculum, as it pertains to the kinds of texts that that your child, that you want your child to read in the classroom. So I think, yes, it's a smaller scale, but certainly I always encourage people to operate within their spheres of influence. And so if you're a parent, even just going to a parent-teachers association meeting and being able to bring up these concerns, that could simply be the spark for change. Certainly, I think there are other people who would agree with you. and maybe one person bringing it to the fore will cause others to rally around them. And I think that's a powerful step. And if someone is an educator, then you may be able to come up with creative ways to bring into the classroom text to supplement whatever standard text you might be using. So I always say look for ways to assert your voice and your agency, no matter how small, because I think that's important. If we want to see changes in the curriculum, it's important to try whatever we can.
I have a bunch of questions, so I'm actually going to move on. And Ibram, if I may ask you this one. What anti-racist actions do you hope readers are inspired to take as a result of reading 400 Souls?
Wow, I probably would sort of rephrase it to, is there anything I don't expect us to do? I mean, hopefully this book will really just galvanize people first and foremost to do what Black people have always been asserting and demanding, and that is, treating us like we're imperfect, beautiful humans. But I think even more than that, for you to sort of continue on in studying the history of African Americans. I suspect many people who may read this book, and maybe the first single volume history of African Americans that they've ever read, and there's so many other volumes on African American history that this can be an introduction to. And I know that the more people understand African American history, the more they understand American history, the more they understand themselves, and the more they understand how to be anti-racist in this moment.
Next question. Can you comment on the use of the word souls in the book, as well as the title? Why don't you tackle that one for me, Professor Blain?
Sure. One of the earliest analogies that Ibram used in really explaining the book, which I think is so powerful, is thinking of this text as a choir, and particularly through the lens of the Black choir. For those of us who might have gone to Black churches and understand the significant role of choirs in these spaces, and how everyone comes together to play a part to create something beautiful. And so with that particular analogy, the emphasis is on how the history sings and how soulful it is. And so 400 Souls is a play on that word of thinking about the soulfulness of the history, but also to alluding to two core themes that run through the text, one being spirituality broadly, and the second being religion. So that's the short answer for why we use 400 Souls as opposed to 400 years.
Next question. This is a great question, and I'm asked this a lot, and I often have to punt and send them to adult books because I think there's sometimes more suggestions. Do you have suggestions, the writer asks, for children's books about race and America? I'm going to ask you both to answer this question. Professor Kendi, will you start for me? Where would you send? And I for some reason, feel like this is a parent who's trying to navigate something that's a little challenging. Where would you send them first?
Wow. So if the child is in the middle grades or in high school, I would send them to books written by Jacqueline Woodson and Renee Watson, Jason Reynolds, Nick Stone, Angie Thomas, Elizabeth Acevedo, Nicole Yoon. I mean, there's so many incredible writers, who are producing, incredible, books on race, for children. And so to give those names again, I think I said Angie Thomas and Nick Stone and Jason Reynolds and Elizabeth Acevedo and Jacqueline Woodson, and that's just a start.
And maybe the question for you then, Professor Blain, is what should parents be looking for in books as they try to navigate? I think this is a tough thing for a lot of parents right now as their children see a lot of what's unfolding kind of in the world and on television and on social media, and they're trying to navigate the best way to help their kids. What should parents be looking for as they look at some of the reading material for their kids?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would encourage people to look for something that I always look for as a parent, and that is making sure that you're introducing your child to narratives that center Black agency. And what do I mean? Being careful with the kinds of stories that talk about everything perhaps being done to Black people. And of course, we're historians, we understand the larger historical forces, we understand the roles that systems and institutions play. And I'm not discounting that, but I think it's important to introduce narratives that help children see that Black people as thinkers, Black people as theorists, Black people as strategists, Black people as activists, right? Black people as movers and shapers of their own destinies, of their own histories, and as culture shifters and all of that, because unfortunately many of the narratives that we hear on the television and other spaces do not celebrate Black agency, and I think it's important to do that, as 400 Souls certainly does.
Next question. It's a great question. I'd like you both to answer it. How have you felt about the backlash by some to the idea of this retelling of history? And I sort of put that in quotes because I think in a lot of ways this is not quite a retelling. It hasn't been told. And the discomfort is not that it's a retelling, it's a first telling that's maybe not sitting well with some people. Clearly, some of it is a political device. But I'd like you both to talk about that in the work that you're doing, the backlash. Why don't you start for me, Professor Kendi?
Well, I do think it's important for us to recognize that there are indeed elected officials today who are not doing anything for their constituents. They're not improving their standard of living. They're not ensuring that they're protected from COVID. They're not doing anything, but they want to appear as if they're doing something. So they've decided, of course, to go after those of us who are writing an accurate sort of history, of America, or even identifying racism when we see racial inequity and injustice. And they have continuously, of course, putting out ideas about critical race theory, about the 1619 Project, about 400 Souls, about anti-racism, about all these efforts that are really seeped in a yearning for justice and truth and equity. And to me, it's unfortunate because you have many people who don't know that they're being manipulated into believing that their elected officials are actually doing something, when they're not. But what I will say very quickly, is that to me, there's been so many Americans who've been taught so many lies about this nation's past, that the lie that, yes, things were bad, but they were made okay by the Civil War, or they became bad again, but everything became good when we passed civil rights legislation in the 60s, or when a Black man assumed the presidency. And so those people of color are just crying for no reason. And they're actually the true problem. Those are all lies, and we've consistently proven them to not be true.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just briefly say that the backlash is to be expected. I always tell people that you're not really doing, meaningful anti-racist work if you're not receiving backlash, if you're not receiving resistance. That's a sign that you're not actually challenging the status quo. History has taught us that every time there is progress, every time there is a step forward, there will be backlash. We saw it after the passage of the Brown decision in 1954. We saw it after the Civil Rights Act. We saw it after the Voting Rights Act, and the list goes on. And so I'm not too concerned about the backlash. It's actually expected, and for me, a sign that we're doing something of consequence. And so we just have to keep pushing forward.
Next question. How can we ensure a more equitable future, specifically for Black women? Who wants to tackle that one? I'm volunteering Professor Blain to start us off.
Yes. Wow. Where to begin? As you asked that question, the first thought that came to my mind is actually, just concerning the high rate of mortality, as it pertains to, Black women giving birth. I just remain stunned at the statistics and simply cannot understand how in this nation, despite all of the progress that we'd like to talk about, so many Black women are to this day losing their lives in the process of giving birth, and that of course speaks to larger inequities in the healthcare system, as we have seen when it comes to COVID-19. So as we think about how to make life better, we certainly have to talk about greater access to quality healthcare. And thankfully, I think we're already seeing some steps with the new administration toward coming up with ways to make sure that Black women have the help that they need, the support that they need when they are pregnant, and even those who are thinking about becoming pregnant and planning for starting a family, that they know that they have access to the resources to be able to have a safe experience. So that's one thing that comes to mind, but so many challenges, as you all know.
Final question goes to you, Professor Kendi, which would be, so when you think about all those challenges, are you optimistic?
I wouldn't say I'm necessarily optimistic or pessimistic, but I would say that I'm hopeful, and some people consider hopefulness to be a form of optimism. And I'd say I'm hopeful just at a philosophical level. I believe you have to believe change is possible in order to bring it about. And indeed, I think, going back to 400 Souls, we told so many stories of ordinary people. No one has, we're not necessarily known, and incredible, prominent people. And one through line is these people believed that one day chattel slavery would be no more. These people believed that one day Jim Crow, would fly away. These people believed that we could achieve a nation that's equitable and just, and that's why they kept fighting on. And I think that's really how, in a way, the book ends with Professor Blain's beautiful piece that indeed we have to sort of move and act and live and fight in that tradition.
It is a beautiful way to end this great conversation. Thank you to our audience for these fantastic questions. And thank you, of course, to the two of you for this discussion. Really appreciate it.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thanks to Ibram, Keisha, and Soledad for the conversation. And thanks also to the folks in the audience who asked questions. If you'd like to be one of those audience members for a future Crosscut event, go to crosscut.com/events. This episode of Crosscut Talks was engineered by Chi Lee. The live recording was engineered by Resty Bacall and Victoria Ralph, and the event was produced by Jake Newman and Andrea O'Meara. Ann Krisnovich and Mo Cloud managed our audience engagement. If you'd like to subscribe to Crosscut Talks, you can do just that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. And if you would like to support the work that we do at Crosscut, whether it's the live events we host every month or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/support. Crosscut Talks is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Mark Baumgarten. We'll be back soon with another conversation.